In this episode, we discuss the divorce dataset. Data sources are provided in the episode description. While preparing for this material, I noticed that in publications the majority of divorce statistics are given for 1,000 inhabitants. You can now see an example chart with such data on the screen. The data provided in this way does not add much. Perhaps they once made sense, when almost all adults got married in their third decade of life. Today this no longer works for several reasons. The number of informal relationships increased, the average age at marriage increased, and the world population began to decline. So the number of marriages decreased. If you compare the number of divorces per 1,000 inhabitants in such an environment, you will notice that these statistics have been decreasing for several years in many countries, for example the USA, France, or Japan. But, I repeat, this does not reflect the scale of the phenomenon. We always have to look at numbers critically. And this is such an example. Please see how quickly the number of marriages is falling. This phenomenon covers the whole world, poorer and richer countries. A temporary spike is observed in some countries, for example China and Russia. But in these two cases, most marriages will end in divorce. The phenomenon of a decline in the number of marriages concluded per 1,000 inhabitants is more visible in the longer term. The true picture is provided by the information on the number of divorces given for 1,000 marriages. It is difficult to obtain such data, but we will present it to you today. For the USA, we have an interesting chart showing the percentage of marriages ending in divorce. This chart is very informative. The colored lines depict marriages concluded in different decades of the 20th century. Navy blue line, marriages concluded in the 1950s. Green, 60s. Brown, 70s. Light blue, 80s. Pink, 90s. The age of marriages counted from their conclusion is given on the lower scale. On the vertical axis, divorce percentage. You can read a lot of information from this chart, but two things caught my attention. American marriages concluded in the 1950s are twice as durable as marriages concluded in later decades. The weakest marriages were formed in the 1970s. Every second one did not survive longer than 25 years. And now the second observation. Since the next decade, i.e., since the 1980s, the divorce rate among married couples has been decreasing slightly. Please compare the brown and light blue lines. Divorce rates remain the same until about the 8th year of marriage, but then decline slightly. The next decade, the 1990s, seems to continue this trend. Until about the 5th year after marriage, the divorce rate is the same as in marriages entered into in the 1980s and 1970s, but then it declines slightly. We can talk about a downward trend, although it is weaker than the upward trend that between the 1950s and 1970s pushed the divorce rate to the highest levels in U.S. history. In this example we see that for every action there is a reaction. It is a physical phenomenon, and in relation to society, it is more cybernetic. Seasoned stock market players know that no trees grow to the sky. Now I will show you an interesting fact. Share of children conceived by single mothers. Chile and Mexico clearly dominate this small sample. In Japan, it is rare for a single mother to conceive a child. Here we see an upward trend around the world. If it continues, the man's role will be reduced to a sperm donor. But let's remember Newton's third law of motion: for every action there is a reaction. On Wikipedia you can find a summary of divorce statistics for about 100 countries in the world. Please note that these are half of the world's countries, not all countries. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are not interested in the crude rate column, only the ratio percent column. In this table, countries are ordered from those in which marriage is the most permanent. There is no data for Tunisia and Uruguay, but we know that Uruguay is the most liberal country in South America. I will start with a country that is not on this list because divorces do not exist there under applicable law. This is the Philippines. India in this table is the country with the strongest marriages in the world. 1,400,000,000 people live in strong families. Only 1 in 100 marriages break up. And here's an interesting fact. In Hinduism, marriage is a sacrament. Perhaps the statistics presented prove that religion is treated seriously by its followers. What do you think about it? Write a comment. Vietnam is second in the world. It is a country experiencing intense economic development, and only 1 in 7 marriages ends in divorce. An increase in wealth often loosens social bonds. This is not the case here. One might consider whether the largest army in the world is responsible for these data. Yes, you haven't heard wrong. Vietnam has an army of over 5 million soldiers, of which over 800,000 are active. The rest are reservists who remember real warfare from the 1970s. Statistics published by Forbes show that professional soldiers are an occupational group with a low divorce rate. Why do you think? Are they loyal, ready to make sacrifices, or perhaps resistant to pain or ready to neutralize threats? Link in the video description. I see Ireland quite high in the table. Here it seems that tradition is responsible for the low divorce rate, around 15%. Until about 30 years ago, the rule in Ireland was not to employ women outside family businesses run by their families. Studies show that more than half of divorces in Africa were initiated by women working outside the home, and the professional group of women in the US most at risk of divorce are secretaries. Let's look at other countries. I admit that I do not notice any special patterns in the group of countries with divorces of less than 15% of marriages. There are continental countries, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, but there are also island countries, Malta and Seychelles. Look at Japan. Hyper-conservative society. 35% divorces in 2019. Corrupt Western Europe, Germany, Great Britain, about 40 to 50%. But below the European Union average, which for 2017 is 45%. Today it will be over 50%. Please note that China, the European Union and the USA, the world's main economic powers, have identical numbers, 45% for 2017 to 2020. Today it will be closer to 50%. The closer to the end of the table, the more Scandinavian countries, but they are not a surprise. Rounding out the peloton are Ukraine and Russia with 74% and 79% of marriages ending in divorce, respectively, and Luxembourg, Spain and Portugal with 79%, 84% and 94% of marriages ending in divorce, respectively. The statistics of the latter countries are so strong that in their case, getting married alone is asking for trouble. Driving against traffic on the highway is probably more successful than getting married on the Iberian Peninsula or east of the Bug River. These numbers are significant, so I decided to take a look at them and came across a study based on Eurostat data, which provides slightly different data for 2021, Ukraine, 57%, Spain 59%, Portugal 60%, Russia 62%, Luxembourg 72%. A bit gentler. By the way, in the same study I found confirmation of the deviation in the trend in the number of divorces in individual decades, which I mentioned earlier for the USA. Data from Eurostat show that between 2010 and 2021, the divorce rate increased in 19 countries, remained unchanged in 2, and decreased in 16. The average increase was 9% and the average decrease was 11%. Divorce rates have increased the fastest in the last decade in Italy, by 31%, and in Finland, by 17%. The fastest decline in divorce rates is in Hungary, a 42% decline, and in the Czech Republic, a 20% decline. If anyone were looking for a relationship between the percentage of marriages ending in divorce and the religiosity of society, the above example shows that there is no such relationship. Please see, Catholic Italy, highest divorce rate in Europe. Half-atheistic Hungary, biggest divorce decline in Europe. Two-thirds Lutheran Finland, second in terms of increasing divorce rates. 2/3 theistic Czech Republic, second decline in divorce rate. Data show that the percentage of marriages ending in divorce in Muslim countries ranges from 15% in Iran to 42% in Kuwait. And although it is lower than in post-Christian countries, it does not indicate an absolute factor inhibiting the number of divorces. The Forbes report confirms our observations, stating that atheists and Protestants in the U.S. have identical divorce rates. And even Hindus owe their lowest divorce rate not to religion, but to culture. For example, neighboring India, Sri Lanka, like India, has an extremely low divorce rate of around 1%, but Buddhism, not Hinduism, dominates there. And this does not mean that Buddhism contributes to the durability of marriage. For example, in Mongolia, half of the population is Buddhist, and the divorce rate is close to the world average. It can be seen that if there are any factors reducing the divorce rate, they are rather cultural patterns, visible to some extent in Turkish, Persian, African, Indian, Arab and island countries. The religious component plays a lesser role here. If it does play a role, it is in an individual perspective and cannot be captured in studies of large social groups. In this episode, we only looked at sociological data with a high degree of generality. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss other interesting analyses.